Good morning, everybody, and welcome to the first panel on the second day of the City UK's National Conference. The overall theme of our conference is recovery, rebalancing and revitalising. And specific attention today we want to spend on rebalancing. I'm Richard Little. I'm the City UK's City Chair for Leeds. And also I lead KPMG's financial services business in the regions of the UK. Now Leeds is a great example of the contribution that the cities and regions and nations of the UK play both to the success of the economy and to the success of our financial and professional services communities. Now in an old world, before the pandemic, I'd have been absolutely delighted to have welcomed you all to Leeds, which is where the conference would have been held. In particular, I've just been listening to Andy Haldane from the Bank of England, who said that whilst London might be the richest city in the UK, it is also the most unhappy. We would have done something about that if you'd been able to join us in Yorkshire. I'm very happy to be joined today by three policymakers, by Kevin, by Alison and Bridget, who I'll introduce formally in a second. Thank you for your time. We're going to cover a range of topics today around rebalancing, around the role that the cities and towns of the UK have in a post-pandemic world, around the aspects of private and public policy cooperation in delivering that rebalancing. And in particular, I think in terms of generating both economic growth, but also opportunity for all across the United Kingdom. We do have the opportunity to take your questions through the Q&A function, and I'll do my best to pick the best of those and ask those on your behalf to the panellists as we move forward. So I'll introduce each panellist in a second and ask them to make some opening remarks around what rebalancing means for them from a personal and a party perspective. I'm going to start with Bridget Phillipson. Bridget is the MP for Houghton and Sunderland South and is Labour's Shadow Chief Secretary to the Treasury. Bridget.
Pleasure to be with you this morning, and I look forward to further discussing in the questions and comments around how we rebalance the economy. I'll just make some more general remarks at first, and then hopefully we can also pick up some of those wider points in the discussion too. We're living in extraordinary times that pose extraordinary challenges for governments all over the world. But I'm sad to say I don't think it's simply a case of bad luck that Britain has had the worst economic hit in the G7. The pandemic has exposed the weaknesses not just in terms of the government's response, but of our economy and our society going into this crisis. 1 in 10 adults in the UK had no savings going into the pandemic. Hundreds of thousands of people are discovering that Britain's social security safety net is barely worthy of its name. And at the same time, we've seen the Chancellor's repeated 11th hour chopping and changing that's made some of these problems just so much worse, with many jobs lost and firms going to the wall. Just in the last fortnight, we've seen what happens when financial services that are so vital to our economy and to the regions as well, treated as an afterthought by the government. It's needless, we think it's irresponsible, and it leaves this vital sector wondering how on earth to plan for the future. As Labour has set out time and time again, the government does have to take responsibility for the months to come so that businesses can plan with some certainty. And right now, the government's priority should be absolutely fixing the test, trace and isolate system. It means getting a clear approach about how restrictions intended to suppress the virus will go hand in hand with economic support to protect jobs and livelihoods. And it also means looking to the future and explaining how the government intends to recover jobs, retrain workers and rebuild businesses. And as our Shadow Chancellor, Annalise Dodd, set out yesterday, it means building back that set of relationships we need between government and between business and society. Businesses should be confident that the government will act responsibly to give them stability and certainty. and there is going to be a huge role for financial services in enabling the recovery that we need. Loans for businesses to invest in the equipment they need to expand again, absolutely essential to rebalancing, supporting new generation of workers to save for their future and for their pension, and putting those savings to work for our country by financing the firms and the technologies of the future that will then create jobs in every part of the UK. So I'm delighted to be with you here today. That's just a few opening remarks from me, and I really look forward to hearing from others and having that conversation. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Bridget. I'll go turn next to Alison Thewliss. Alison is the MP for Glasgow Central. Glasgow, again, like Leeds, one of a significant financial and professional services hub in the UK. And Alison is the SNP's shadow spokesperson on Treasury matters. Alison, thank you and welcome.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you very much for having me. It's a real pleasure to join you this morning. And I appreciate this section's on sort of regional perspectives on rebalancing. So I'll try to balance a bit from how I see things as a Westminster politician from Scotland, and also some of what my colleagues in the Scottish Government are doing in these challenging times. And I've long seen a definite need to rebalance in the UK sense, to shift away from that London-centric point of view. But there's also a very valid argument to have in Scotland about this as well. And the pandemic has given given many of us the chance to rebalance, to work from home and spend a bit more time discovering our own local economies when we step away from these Zoom meetings. But there are serious implications for the functioning of our cities as a result. For many of us, it's about our own broadband connectivity and our heating bills, but there's less focus, I feel, on what that actually means for those who cannot work from home and whose livelihoods depend upon, for example, the city centre economy, the shops, the cafes, the cleaners, the security guards. And if the rebalancing is to continue in this vein, we just cannot afford to leave those people behind. And we have an opportunity, a long overdue opportunity here, to make change, to accelerate and move to a more environmentally responsible, well-being focused economy. And the Scottish Government, for their part, have put green recovery at the very heart of the programme for government and are updating these plans to reflect the situation that we have with COVID as well. But this is and has to be tied very closely to social justice and the need to transition from industries such as oil and gas and embracing the opportunities of new green renewable energy. And the way that we see this is with an eye to the past in the parts of Scotland as well as parts of other parts of the UK, which still bear the scars of rapid deindustrialisation. And we need to acknowledge in this that we don't all start from the same place. We need to look at these disparities, why they exist, and what we need to put in place before we can even talk about levelling up, because those scars are very deep in some places. We have a health gap, a geography gap, a wealth gap, a gap between old and young, a gap between the types of jobs that people have in different parts of the country. And COVID has exposed gaps between those who can save and those who have no savings whatsoever and are really struggling just now. So in looking at rebalancing and recovery, we have to harness the potential of our people and leave no one behind. And in Scotland, we know that we cannot do this alone. And the Scottish Government, of course, does not have the full range of fiscal levers of an independent country yet. So we need to work with investors, with business and with institutions to make that recovery happen. And an example of this is the Scottish Government's Green Investment Portfolio, which was launched in September. So we're looking in a planned strategic way at the challenges our communities face, the need to create good, green, quality, sustainable, in all senses, jobs, and what we can then do to rebalance, to bring in that investment and to work in partnership right across the board to make sure that recovery lasts and is there for the future for all of our people.
Thank you, Alison. And I say we will return to some of those themes later on in the Q&A. Last but not least, I'd like to introduce Kevin Hollinrake. Kevin is the Conservative MP for Thirsk and Malton, well known to many of you through his role as co-chair of the all-party parliamentary group on fair business banking. Kevin, great to see you. Be good to get your initial thoughts on rebalancing, please.
Yeah, thanks, Richard. And well, for me, it's got to be about prosperity. It's got to be people seeing real difference in terms of their living standards right across the country. And that's not a zero-sum game. So this is about people in the north being just as prosperous as people in the south. We know Andy Halburn, who you've had speaking to you earlier, said quite recently that gross value added per capita is 2.5 times greater in London and the South East compared to the North East. That's simply not good for the people of the North East, including Yorkshire, and nor is it good for UK PLC. And so there's a real opportunity. This is not a zero-sum game. It's a real opportunity for the country as well as for those people. And I absolutely agree with you, Richard. This has got to be a combination between the public sector and the private sector. So, and we know for too long, this has been decades of underinvestment in places like the North and the East Midlands. This shouldn't be about party politics. You know, we know that for every pound that's spent per capita on transport projects in the North, there's around £3 per capita spent in London and South East. And that's what rebalancing is about, but that's a means to an end. So spending more on transport infrastructure in the North is a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. So to do that, we need to change things like the Green Book, which is how we assess value for money in terms of projects, of course. So we do need to make all those investments in transport infrastructure. But I think we also have to be honest and recognise the scale of this problem. The scale of this problem is on a similar level to the reunification of Germany, West Germany and East Germany. That took $3 trillion to get to Germany to a place where prosperity is evenly distributed, and it took 2 decades, of course. So this is a huge project. That's why it can't be party political. Interesting reading some of the economists' view on this as well. Just to illustrate, it cannot just be about infrastructure. Mark Littlewood, who's the chief exec of the Institute for Economic Affairs, of course, in an interesting piece in the Times, said, if everything was about connectivity, why isn't Doncaster more prosperous? Because Doncaster is very well connected, yet it's not all that prosperous a town. And that's not Doncaster's fault. There's other issues as well. And as David Smith, the economist, said, who writes in the Times, as many of you will know, prosperity is delivered through a combination of private and public sector investment. So yes, of course, to HS2. Yes, of course, to A and B. So going to North, East and North West, Northern Powerhouse Rail, all kind of projects like that. But also we've got to create incentives for businesses and the financial services sector, which I know 2/3 of the job in the financial services sector are located outside London, which is great. We want to further incentivise that distribution of jobs. So I would like to see, as well as things like free ports, which are really good initiatives, I'd like to see big enterprise zones, which are often at the moment just business parks, whole towns or whole devolved regions, maybe the devolved regions with the lowest, I'm talking about metro mayors here, rather than devolved nations, but for those with the lowest GVA, those given enterprise zone status or capital allowances or EIS enhancements or business rates breaks to attract more investment in those regions. I'd like to see regional mutual banks who have a long-term patient capital approach to the economies in those regions. Lots of things we can do to make it more attractive for wonderful private sector organisations like many of your members, Richard, to invest across the North and East Midlands and the rest of the country, anywhere where we don't see the prosperity we do in London and the South East.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you all for those opening comments and remarks. I think there's an awful lot that you've already covered in terms of topics, issues, and both the challenges and the responses. And let's just focus for a moment on those responses. I'll come back to you, Kevin, first. But I'm interested in, from all the panelists, in your views on what can the financial services and the professional services communities that are represented throughout this conference be doing more of, working with government to deliver that nationwide growth. So what's your ask of the audience in terms of what you'd like to see more from this community of businesses? Kevin, I'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, clearly we want new investments. You know, we know that private sector businesses want to see a return on investment, of course. So we've got to make sure that stacks up, and return on investment has got to be as good in terms of investing in jobs and new facilities in the north as it is in London and South East. So you can understand why sometimes those calculations, similar to the Green Book, are show a preference for investment in London and South East. So there's got to be some reason why you do that, why I talk about incentives, because if you can make it clearly, property costs are cheaper in the north and the Midlands than they are in compared to London and the South East. But any incentives we can give to make sure the investment decision is more attractive for the north and the Midlands, then we should try and make that choice easier for you. But really, we want your investment. We want you to bring jobs up here. You know, we know because of the changes in the economy, which have been accelerated due to COVID, it's not so important to have people located around certain locations anymore. The City of London being an obvious example. So we'd like you to be more open-minded about some of the locations you can go to. It doesn't need to just be Leeds or Manchester, which are great financial services centres, professional services centres. It could be Darlington, it could be Bishop Auckland, it could be Malton. Wherever you feel that we want you to be more open-minded in terms of the investments you make and where you make them.
Thank you, Kevin. And I will pick up later on with all the panellists the agglomeration effect and how cities and towns might be impacted differently. But Alison, can I come to you next in terms of your expectations and asks of the financial and professional services communities?
I think my biggest ask is just to keep things steady, not to make any kind of rash decisions in the situation that we're in. And I'm particularly pleased that Barclays have their huge campus that they're investing in Glasgow. And you could look at this giant office block coming out of the ground in the banks of the Clyde and go, oh my goodness, this is a terrible time to build an office block. But they have kept the faith with that and said, no, we've looked at it. We think this is a sound investment. We think this is something that we still want to do. And that's continuing, and they're continuing to hire people, to look at the apprentices that they want to bring in, to look at the diversity of their workforce as well, and who additionally can they bring in, and being quite responsible in the way that they're approaching that, to try and make it as inclusive as possible as well, bringing in all kinds of different folk to work in that building. And I think that's the kind of approach that I would like to see, to have businesses keep that confidence, and to continue to employ people from a huge range of backgrounds, because this could be the time to sort of to tighten things up and look in your own small bubble, but actually they're saying, no, we need to push that out, we need to make it as wide as possible. And I think that's the kind of example that is worth replicating. And also to look for new opportunities as well, where perhaps you wouldn't normally take your business and say, well, can we do this differently this time?
Thanks, Alison. Bridget, really interested in your perspectives in terms of working together with the business leaders that will be watching and listening to us this morning.
Yeah, thanks very much, Richard. I mean, it would be remiss of me not to add to Kevin's excellent list of great places in the North East, not to mention Sunderland, and you know, which is a great place to live, work, and do business. And I think, you know, Kevin is quite right to draw attention to the fact that, you know, that there are great places for businesses to grow and thrive right across the regions and nations. And you know, we believe that, you know, businesses will be, you know, the financial services sector will be absolutely central in driving job creation. We know it's a really challenging time at the moment, but investment in skills and in apprenticeships and jobs will be absolutely central to that agenda of rebalancing. But we do face a real skills gap, and that requires government and business to work together to get us in the strongest possible position. You know, we know that in many parts of the country, too many adults don't have the basic levels of skills that they need in order to compete in what is an increasingly difficult and competitive jobs market. So those initiatives where businesses and employers can work together with government on that issue around skills, I think is really important. I mean, more generally, in terms of the role of financial services and banks especially, I think there's a lot more that we can be looking to do together around moving to meeting our net zero targets. You know, the finance sector as a whole, in terms of, you know, becoming more green itself, directing capital towards green technologies and jobs of the future, working with government to support that kind of job creation, particularly in communities that most desperately need to see new jobs and investment. Public sector investment alone will not be the answer. It will require government and business to work together. I appreciate that many are already playing their part in doing that, but I always think that there's more that we could and should be doing. Targets around net zero are ambitious, but they do, as well as mitigating the climate crisis we face, I think present real opportunities for parts of our country to support job creation and business investment. I think that would be they'd be my key points around net zero and skills.
Thank you, Bridget. I'm just interested to develop the conversation on a. I absolutely understand the net zero ambition and the long-term desire to make change, but that is going to be on a longer-term basis. I'd be very interested in the panelists' perspectives, and I'll start with you, Alison, on this one. I'd be very interested in your perspectives on the immediate support that has been provided to SMEs in particular, and maybe some forward-looking thoughts as to how the financial services community can continue to support SMEs across the country, both dealing with the immediate impact of the pandemic, but then thinking forward to the recovery phase across the country.
Thank you. And I don't particularly want to come on here for the purpose of having a go at the UK government. I think the difficulty for many SMEs is not being able to plan and not having that kind of that sense that we're going to be in this coronavirus crisis for quite some time, in the way that other countries in Europe have said, what we need to plan for 18 months here, rather than just planning a month ahead. And the change to the coronavirus job support scheme coming sort of being announced on the day it was supposed to be cancelled, that caused huge chaos for many of the SMEs in my constituency, because they were genuinely expecting to have to lay off lots of loyal staff, causing a huge shock in unemployment. So that kind of forward planning has made it very difficult for SMEs. I would like to see a bit more certainty given to SMEs for what they can plan for and how to make that happen. I'm also slightly worried, while it has been really good that financial institutions have managed to get money out to people, there have been issues with CBILS and WeBILS, which I've had lots of casework on, but where they have been able to get money out to people, that has helped. But I am worried about businesses that are just building up more and more debt, particularly when we come into next year and then they're having to look at other VAT payments or business rates that they've deferred and other things like that. So I think there needs to be a bit of forward planning for what happens when we get to March next year, what happens with that debt that's being sustained, and perhaps the government and banks working together to convert some of those loans into grants or convert them into equity for some businesses if that's appropriate, just to smooth that out a wee bit and give businesses a bit more certainty going ahead.
Kevin, clearly interested in your perspectives, both as a policymaker, but also as having been involved in your business roles, as to the response of the banks, in particular with SME lending, and where perhaps we can and should be doing more.
Yeah, I mean, I think coming into this crisis, the banks were determined to restore the reputation, and much as I work on some of the more egregious kind of treatment of SMEs from banks over the last decade or so, generally I had a very good relationship with my own business career. I'm still in business now with banks, and by and large they treat people very well and very fairly. And I think in terms of CBILS and WeBILS, they've done a brilliant job in getting those loans out the door really quickly. And like Alison, we deal with the cases where those haven't gone according to plan for some businesses, but by and large, that's been a very successful scheme, well operated by the British Business Bank and the banks, and well designed by the Treasury. I mean, one thing I would say, I'm still in business now, I'm very optimistic about the future. I've been through 3 recessions. Normally, you are years of getting out of recession. Every time we reopen the economy, it comes flooding back in. The business comes flooding back in, which is great. Not for every sector, it's got to be said. And some businesses, in some situations, in some locations, are going to find it very difficult in the future. But huge opportunities, and ultimately what the Chancellor's trying to do is get the economy back on its feet, and it can't live on taxpayer support forever. So, and that obviously it was disappointing. We've effectively hit a second wave, but things like vaccines, mass testing, surge capacity in the health service, all that kind of stuff, because we know that sooner or later we're going to have to live with this virus. We cannot just hide away from it, as the Chancellor said. So we need a new iteration of schemes. Certainly, job retention scheme, as Alison has said, is important, particularly to get us through the next few months, but also a next generation of civils and bibbles, some equity finance. I'm not a fan of writing off loans that have been made, because what message does that say to businesses who didn't take the loan? What message does that say to businesses who could pay it back? It's simply not right, and it's taxpayers' money. So, but things like forbearance, pay-as-you-go, longer-term repayment periods, things like that would be the right thing. Equity finance through things like EIS, an enhanced version of that. Maintain the VAT cut in hospitality. I think that would, certainly for a period of time, I think that would be very important, and looking at business rates as well in that context, reform of that. But ultimately, I think what business really wants is a period of stability, and it's going to be very, very difficult to find one. But the more we can keep things stable and plan long term for business while weaning off taxpayer support would be, I'm sure, very welcome.
Thank you, Kevin. So I'll come now to Bridget, just in terms of your perspective, as I say, on the support that can and should be given through financial services to SMEs in particular.
I mean, I think picking up where Kevin left off there, I think he's right that stability is absolutely central to all of this. My slight worry going into the new year is, whilst it's incredibly great, it's wonderful news that the prospect of a number of vaccines on the horizon, and that I think would be a massive boost, not just to the whole country, but obviously to economic activity. I do think we need to tread with care in not seeking to pull away support too soon. I think some of the decisions that had been taken by the Chancellor earlier this year have created uncertainty and instability at a time when business could ill afford for that to happen. I think confidence is central, and from many of the kind of smaller side SMEs I've spoken to, family businesses who've come through a really challenging time, I think they want confidence that they can get customers back. And unless we get to a position where test, trace and isolate is working as well as it should be working, it will just be harder for some of those businesses to do it. And of course, for some businesses, they've just not been able to access the same level of support from their lender or government support. And it's been a pretty tough time coming through this. But like Kevin, I'm optimistic in that we have wonderful, talented people with great ideas about the kinds of businesses they want to drive forward. But that's why I think getting us through a period of stability and certainty and supporting business confidence will be absolutely essential in all of this. And as Alison was just touching on there, we are entering into a period where mortgage holidays will be coming to an end, and some of those loans will be called into question. So I think getting us through that point with as much certainty from government as possible around some of those underlying areas where they can provide support on the public health response and how that matches up with the economic side, I think will be absolutely essential to supporting our small businesses.
Thank you, Bridget. And I'd say a couple of quick observations from my perspective. I think, first of all, some work has already been done around thinking about solutions that don't just involve providing debt to businesses. So to your points around investment through equity or some other mechanism that doesn't just result in businesses taking on more and more debt, because I don't think many would say that's a long-term sustainable position when you're looking to generate growth. And also, I think lots of businesses are going to face a challenge. Financial services businesses are going to face a challenge of managing the repayment of those loans from both a reputational and regulatory perspective that, again, we shouldn't underestimate. But I would just like to change tack slightly and be interested in all of your perspectives. We talked about rebalancing between the regions and nations of the UK, but I think in various points this morning, you've also all talked about the role that cities and towns have. And I'd just be interested, coming to you, Alison, first as a city centre MP, as to the prospects and challenges that Glasgow will face in terms of retaining its place as a centre of economic activity. And I say, if you could talk about the role of the private sector in the success of Glasgow, I'll then cover with Kevin and Bridget maybe a different perspective, thinking about towns rather than cities. But I say this dynamic between towns and cities is really interesting.
Yeah, and I think there's a real challenge ahead for cities as to how cities cope with this, whether the working from home that many of us have been doing is something that's going to keep as a trend, or whether that's going to be we all will eventually return back to offices in the future. And I do fear for those city centre businesses in the meantime who can't survive at the moment because they're not having the passing footfall. And the city centre really is struggling in Glasgow as a result of that. And we're just about to move into a period of phase 4 lockdown in Scotland as well, which adds an additional layer of challenge to that. And I think Glasgow's been looking for a while at how you repopulate the city centre, how you get people living in the city centre again, because we had moved from a situation where lots of people did live in the city centre to a place where it was dead when there wasn't businesses in during the week. And I think that perhaps is somewhere that cities need to look more at. But how do you repopulate your city centre? How do you get people in to live there and to use it in a different way than we've been used to? And I think that's definitely the direction that I would see this going in, because otherwise you cannot just accept, I think, a reality that says we don't have cities anymore, because that's not how we've lived, and the economic impact of that would be significant. So I think we need to reinvent in some ways and think about how cities are used, and whether that's through more people living there, through pedestrianisation, through other means of doing that. There's opportunities and there's challenges there, but I do think it's something we need to give serious thought to.
And Bridget, from a representing a northeast constituency, I say with the northeast is a significant employer for professional and financial services, but again, interested as to how you address the future of the towns and cities that are within your constituency and surround it.
And I think part of this goes back to the comments that we had earlier from Kevin around train services and connectivity, that being on a fast train line to London is not the be-all and end-all. I mean, that said, I'm always in favour of improved transport infrastructure, and it's not something that my constituency and large parts of the northeast see great benefits from. But I think the point where I agree with Kevin is that I think it's not just about that north-south connection, it's also east-west and the kind of intra-regional connectivity that I think is absolutely essential. So for many of my constituents, the inability to get readily and easily from a town within Sunderland to, say, North Tyneside or Newcastle or Durham is far more of a problem, although there are issues coming on the horizon around infrastructure on the East Coast Main Line. I think that kind of connectivity is absolutely essential in supporting job creation and allowing business investment, because it holds back that growth too often, because it's just too difficult for workers to get between often quite small small area, kind of the number of miles required to travel is not large, but the journeys involved are often very difficult indeed. So, for example, former bus services would be, whilst often overlooked, would be an absolutely essential part of shaping some of that connectivity. It also, I think, does go back to skills, that even if we had, to use the government's term of the moment, world-beating infrastructure in the northeast of England, and we're very, very far away from that, unless that goes hand in hand with improvements in skills, we wouldn't be in a position to benefit as much as we should. So I think skills remains absolutely essential to that kind of shift that we'll need to see within our economy, but also that intra-regional connectivity. And that change away from car ownership and car usage, although relatively low in large parts of the northeast, and making it easier and more straightforward to go to work on public transport, which frankly at the moment is often too expensive, ineffective, inefficient, with very long journeys involved. And I know from local businesses, often involved in areas like financial services, that retaining staff is more of a challenge, because often shift workers who are, this has obviously changed in recent times, but for those who are required to be on site providing support at often what people would regard it as unusual or antisocial hours. Getting to and from work can be tricky, and that does pose a real challenge in terms of job retention.
And Kevin, from a more rural-based constituency?
Yes. Can I just mention, I thought the City UK recapitalisation report was absolutely critical in forming the debate in terms of the loans, the debt overhang, and I think Pay As You Grow came from that. I think pretty much so. It was a very, very welcome report. So thanks for all your work on that. I mean, yeah, cities. I mean, I would love to see more jobs and more opportunities in rural North Yorkshire, of course, and we are seeing a bit of that. We're seeing more people working locally and more and when the cafes could open and the pubs and restaurants busier than ever, which is excellent to see. I don't think we'll know quite what will happen in terms of cities until we're past the crisis. So hopefully, second quarter next year. My gut feeling is, and you see lots of very knowledgeable and experienced investors still investing in property in London, for example, and Leeds, Manchester. So I don't think we've seen some massive, migration away from cities, but we won't know properly. I mean, we know ourselves, as parliamentarians, we're still allowed to work in Westminster, in the Palace of Westminster, and it's much more effective being there than Zoom calls, much as they have their uses. So I think that agglomeration effect in terms of within a workplace and within a context of something like the City of London or Central Leeds is going to be really important still, I think. So I don't think things will change all that much, but there is definitely an acceleration of some trends. Working more remotely to some extent. Online shopping, of course, increasing online shopping from 20% of retail to 35%, I think it is now, and some of the overcapacity in hospitality. All those things will mean some sectors, some businesses are really going to struggle. So there's definitely going to be some changes precipitated through this crisis. I'm not a big believer that the government should get involved in what the solutions will be to all that. We should definitely do the infrastructure stuff. We should definitely contribute to the skills stuff, although I think businesses too should be far more involved in education in terms of making sure we deliver the right skills for businesses, particularly for young people and retraining. But really picking winners. Pfizer will probably be the first people who produce a vaccine for COVID. They didn't take any government money. The iPhone wasn't produced by a government organisation or government entity. It was private sector capital. I'm a big believer that we should put the infrastructure in place and let business develop the solutions to our future economy. And I think generally the future, I think, is very, very bright.
That's a good message to hear, and I'd like to take that and just develop it a little further, just in terms of thinking about. We've talked already about reputational concerns that the industry has had in the past, and I think the improvements that the sector has made. But I'd be interested in all of your views on the purpose of financial services as we move out of this crisis, and any observations in terms of both the purpose of our organisations and our reputation with you as policymakers and with regulators in terms of driving that future success of the economy. I'll start with you, Alison, and then come to Bridget and Kevin.
I think I'm not quite sure how to answer the question of purpose, I suppose. But I think continuing to work closely with us is important, and I've had quite a good relationship with a number of different institutions over the course of pandemic and before, but it's really been quite useful to be able to catch up regularly, both with folk based in my constituency and more nationally. And I think that kind of continual checking in and just seeing how things are going, and are things working for your constituents, and are there issues you're picking up, gives us a really good opportunity to get in early and to make sure that what's happening and what your understanding is of the problem is the same understanding that we're finding on the ground. And that continual dialogue, I think, is the most important thing here, so that we can say, look, here's a problem, here's a solution, can we work together on that together? And I think that's really where we need to continue that dialogue, not to say once this is over, we'll just go back into the old ways of doing things, but continuing that dialogue, making sure that the focus is there on investment, on good quality jobs, and on creating a fairer economy, and making sure that, that the fit is there with what businesses are looking for in the economy in terms of skills, or the wider environment, or in terms of what they're asking for in terms of government support, and that we can try and make sure that those things fit well together, so that we can continue that for the future.
Thank you, Alison. Bridget, in terms of your views on, say, current reputation of the sector and what we should be striving for, I say, as a sector as we come out of the pandemic.
Yeah, thanks very much. I mean, I think the sector has done well in supporting businesses during this crisis, and responding to what has been a very rapidly changing and quite volatile environment. So I think that has been important. What we would be looking to into the future would be to see how business, financial services, and government can work together in a partnership to support jobs, investment, and drive our country forward. I think there is more that should be done there. And kind of going back on the discussion we were just having there around the drivers of economic activity and innovation within our country, I think where we see a genuine connection of both government support and private sector innovation, that's where we'll see most success. So those development of new technologies, medical advance, as well as requiring private sector investment, does also require a skilled workforce. It needs research, it needs investment from government in research and development. I think it's how we build that genuine partnership of working together. And I think during this crisis, where we've seen government work well with trade unions, with business, in partnership, I think we've seen that we can achieve remarkable things. And I hope that into the future we can continue to see that partnership, that way of working together, that I think will put the UK in the strongest possible position to compete, and can support financial services and businesses of all sizes right across our country at what will be, of course, understandably, a difficult time for many years to come. But I think there is genuine opportunity there if we work together.
Thank you, Bridget. And Kevin, final words from you, say, on the future direction and purpose of the industry would be really helpful.
Yeah, I mean, competitive free markets deliver the best outcome for consumers by a long way. They drive up service, it drives down prices, and so, but you can't have a capitalist system if people have not got access to capital. So the whole financial services sector, particularly those involved in banking for SMEs, which obviously I'm heavily involved in, has got a social purpose as well as it's got a commercial purpose. So, and I think lots of people in the banking sector understand that, and in fact it was framed as that in the Companies Act. The companies have a responsibility to consumers as well as to the shareholders. So, but at times I think people have lost sight of that. Nobody goes to work to do a bad job, but I think at times the banking sector probably will look at itself and think we got that totally wrong for various different reasons, not all of which I blame the banking sector for. What I would like to see going future is banks particularly to focus more on the social purpose. I don't think that is mutually exclusive around shareholder returns. I think both things sit together well. And a good example of that, on the back of past problems and to prevent problems happening in the future, we've now got an expansion of the remit of the Financial Ombudsman Service to deal with cases up to 6.5 million, businesses with cases up to £6.5 million turnover, for example, and a voluntary scheme above that with the 7 major banks to setting up something called the Business Bank Resolution Service to deal with businesses with turnover up to £10 million. That's all been done on a voluntary basis, the latter part of it, and banks have willingly helped with the FOS expansion too. So that's a great example, I think, of how we can address some of the problems of the past without it damaging the shareholder interests of banks. In fact, I think it will enhance it, because if businesses think it's safe to borrow, they're more likely to borrow, which is good for banks. So I think there's this kind of symbiotic relationship we should have. One further ask I'd have with the banking sector, we know there's quite a lot of businesses that currently bank with non-bank lenders, people like Tide, for example, cannot get access to bounce-back loans because those non-bank lenders don't have access to the Bank of England's Term Funding Scheme for SMEs. So I would urge banks to provide a solution there, either to take in new customers on a feeder account basis, or provide money into these non-bank lenders so they can lend it out to their customers. I think that would be, there's about 250,000 businesses in that situation. And I think we don't want to see in a year or two's time looking back thinking, my God, those businesses were left behind because they couldn't get access to finance. So I'm sure there's a solution there within the banking sector that they could deliver.
Thank you, everyone. I'm unfortunately having to draw the conversation to a close as we're at 1:45. But I think if I summarise in some of the key words and phrases that I've heard from all of you, it's been around partnership, it's been around skills, it's been around investment. And I think all of us at certain stages have also used the word optimistic or variations on that theme. And I think that's a really good word to finish this session around the optimism that can and should exist as we move forward. So thank you to participants for your Q&A, but most importantly, thank you to our three panelists, to Bridget, Alison and Kevin, for your contributions this morning. It is greatly appreciated, and we'll bring the session to a close there, but thank you once again.
Thank you very much.